is going to give lecture on how to avoid desk rejection and identity suitable journal. Before we start, let me explain how can we talk to us during the workshop. If you have any questions during the presentation, just write them to the chat box and we will have a question and answer sessions at the end of to answer your questions. Now, I would like to call convener Dr. Sanjay Kumar Yadav sir to welcome the dignitaries and participants.
Sir, very good afternoon. This is Dr. Sanjay Kumar Yadav. I, I am very, very thankful to you, sir, to accept my invitation. Sir, I would like to inform that we have received near about 200 registrations from all over India and some countries, part of the countries like Singapore, USA, UK, and Zambia. So I am very, very grateful that you are invited in our university to deliver your lecture. And I would like to invite Madam to introduce Arpankar sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, sir. Before commencing today's program, I am profusely overjoyed to take the opportunity to introduce guest speaker, Professor Arpan Kumarkar. Professor Arpan Kumarkar is Professor of Information Systems in Indian Institute of Technology, New Delhi. He holds the A.S. Gupta Endowed Chair Professorship in Data and Decision Science within IIT Delhi, along with the Department of Management Studies. He holds a joint appointment in the Yardi School of Artificial Intelligence. Administratively, he chairs corporate affairs and is a member of the advisory committee for the overall curriculum development cell. Additionally, he is a member of the faculty search committee and professional committees, department research committees, and timetable in charge. His research and teaching interests are in the domain of adoption, usage, user experience, governance, and impacts of emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, digital platforms, social media, mobile apps, metaverse, and blockchain on individuals, groups, and society. His work involves theorizing based on empirical evidence, often using computationally incentives research methods involving machine learning. He is the recipient of the Excellence in Teaching Award by Indian Institute of Technology, New Delhi, based on the highest teaching feedback within IIT Delhi. He has supervised over 14 doctoral scholars and over 75 master's dissertations. In total, he has authored over 250 peer-reviewed publications and edited 15 research books. He has published over 80 articles in ABDCA. Now, I'm requesting Professor Arpan Kumar sir to take over the session.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thanks so much for all this warm welcome and this wonderful introduction. So I'll try to share my slides, if that is fine.
Yes, sir. You can share.
Right now, I don't have that privilege to share that. My screen sharing has to be enabled so that I can share my slides.
Yes, sir. Now you can share, sir.
Okay, thank you. So hope my screen is visible.
Yes, sir. It's visible and you're audible also.
Thank you so much. So what I'll do is I'll start off my session, and my topic is something which is about how to target good journals and also avoid desk rejections. I'll share a little bit of my perspectives as I started my journey as an academic. So when I started my career about some I'll say around 12 years back, research in India was not that much focused upon, because in those days in IDF ranking, uh, different elements like QS rankings, they never came, and they never tried to focus more on the rankings were never focused on research, especially in a B school setting. The rankings were never focused on research. So whatever I learned was through mistakes. So whatever I learned I had some very good collaborators who also gave me a very useful feedback. But a lot of this I learned through a lot of mistakes, through a lot of rejections. And what I'm going to share is more about this journey that I took. And today, when I'm as an editor in other journals, whether it is in the journal of IGIM Data Insights, which I oversee and manage, then there are other journals like IJIM, JCIS, then Global Journal of Flexible Systems Management, Communications of the Association for Information Systems, where I have mostly an AE role. So, as an associate editor, what kind of things do I look for, and what kind of things that typically pass through the editorial desk and go forward for the review process? That is what I'm going to share today. So if you have any question, please feel free to type in the chat. I'll try to respond during the session. One small request, if you don't use the pen while I'm presenting the slides. I think there is a pen that has been used. I don't know how to take it off. Somebody has used this pen scribbles while I was using the slides. If that can be avoided, that will be really nice. So I'll make a fresh share. I don't know, I'll have to stop the share and then make a fresh share. So when we are talking about this entire space, when this entire journey of publish or perish started in India, predominantly it started from when the NIRF ranking started coming, mid 2015, 2017, around that time. So NIRF from MHRD, or currently the Ministry of Education, gives 30% weightage to research and professional practice. And both of these things are intertwined because research helps us to get good projects, and good projects help us to get good research publications out. And the second thing that these rankings typically give is a lot of weightage to the citations. So if we do good research, publish in good journals, we are likely to get cited. But if we are not publishing in good journals, then also that becomes a problem. So we need to publish frequently, we need to publish in good journals. At the same time, we have to be careful that wherever we are publishing, it should be something that we should be proud of. It should not be something that is condemned in the academic fraternity. A lot of times from India, people end up publishing in journals which are typically little shady journals. I mean, sometimes we see a lot of reports which talks about the number of retractions which happen from India, and a lot of predatory journals are typically there. So we have to basically focus on good quality journals, which require a lot of different skills, different perseverance, levels of perseverance, so that we can, kind of reach the desired, output and productivity. So when we look at journals, there are many journals. Like first of all, identifying where we should publish, and if we are going to target those journals, then we need to also read those journals. So there are many rankings in terms of how to identify good journals. There are some rankings like ABDC, which is Australian Business Dean's Council, ABS Journal, which is Chartered Association of Business School. There is from France, CNRS Journal. Then from Norway, there is a Norwegian collection of ranking journals. Many such journal rankings are there. And there are more, competitive journal rankings like Financial Times, Bloomberg, or UT Dallas list, which is extremely difficult, especially if you're doing research in a very resource constrained environment like India. But there are other matrices also which are very important. Like a journal should be metrics, indexed in either Scopus or Clarivate Analytics, Web of Science, which gives an indicator that the journal has, typically been following, some of the important matrices of editorial practices, so that you do not end up publishing any rogue journal. So it is always better to have focus on journals which are typically somewhat established, coming from a decent publisher like Elsevier, Wiley, Taylor Francis, Springer Nature. These are typically the bigger publisher, and they have very solid editorial practices. So if you're publishing in these journals, automatically the understanding is that there is your paper has gone through a decent peer review process. If the peer review process is there, then automatically you have undertaken adequate work so that there is not much of question in terms of the quality of your outcome. So those are some of the very elementary things, but very important things, especially if somebody is starting the career, that how do you identify, how do you understand that the research that you're publishing is going to be in decent platforms. Because if you end up publishing papers in not so great platforms, what tends to happen is that we tend to have publications in, say, gray journals. Our profile becomes little gray. So what happens is typically then the good journals will not really trust the submissions which are made by you. It is always good to focus on the quality of publication, the nature of the publication, and target decent journals. But the downside of this is targeting good journals require huge amount of effort, huge amount of commitment. A lot of people often do not have that much of bandwidth to undertake research very strongly. A lot of sometimes students want to do things quickly, complete their papers, complete their manuscript, complete their PhD, and then graduate out. But the problem is a typical editorial journey. If you submit a paper in any decent journal in management, it will take minimum 8 months to a very ordinary journal, but which is, fulfilling these criteria, that will take at least 8, 10 months to minimum 2 years to be in the editorial process and then subsequently bring out a publication. So be ready for that. We as academics, we as research scholars, we as researchers, we need to be okay that if we make a very good manuscript, if we do a very strong study, and we submit to a journal that is worth its salt, then at least 8 months to 10 months is the minimum time which would be taken by the journal to complete the review process. And especially if you're looking at slightly more competitive journals which are rated high in terms of ABTC, ABS, and so on, it may take anything between 1.5 to 2 years. Some of the very competitive journal, it takes 3, 4 years in the editorial review process. So those are some of the very basic but elementary but very important thing that one has to keep in mind. Then the other thing is very important that if you are submitting a paper in a journal which is not listed from one of the major publisher, uh, very important is to check whether the journal is or the publisher is a predatory. So there is this platform, Think, Check, Submit. You can go there and try to type the name of the journal and try to see whether the journal is listed as a predatory journal or not. If it is listed as a predatory journal, never ever submit your paper in there. Even if like they promise that the paper gets accepted very soon, a lot of very fake promises are made that paper goes through a review process, will give you backdated acceptance for money. Those things are very, very shady. Once you get into those, entire academic career can go for a toss. If you have any questions, please feel free to type in the chat box. I'll try to respond as I proceed with my session. So I'll share about a little bit of editorial perspectives, typically how to build an article, and therefore, what are the things you should look into when you are developing your research study. So if you think of those elements when you're developing the research study, automatically they'll get reflected when you're crafting your manuscript. And then the chances of maybe crossing the desk rejection improves little bit more. So one of the important thing is that whenever, okay, there is a question from Dr. Ritu Singh, the name of the website to check predatory journals, that is thinkchecksummit.org. This is one of the websites. There are many other websites. Retraction Watch is also another platform where a lot of websites are typically evaluated. There are many journals which are coming in from larger publishers, but those publishers often have very, I'll say, less rigorous mechanism of rigorous mechanism of undertaking the review process, And that is the reason when they have less rigorous mechanisms for undertaking the review process, then automatically what happens is that a lot more the acceptance rates become very high. And typically, some of the publishers, like there is one journal called Sustainability, which is coming in from, one of the publishers which produces a lot of journals, right? But like Frontiers, then these journals, what happens because their acceptance rate was so high, then what happened was like for some time, there was quite a lot of black marks surrounding the papers which are published in sustainability, and Scopus started withdrawing sustainability from its indexing services. So those kind of problems also happen if you're targeting a journal which might have a very high acceptance rate, and we feel like we'll get an acceptance quickly. But if you're getting a very quick acceptance rate, then the concern surrounding how rigorous the review process is, to what extent it is being, followed adequately, that is not known. And the journal may be indexed right now, but might lose its indexing later on from any one of the larger indexing services like, say, Scopus or, impact factor. So that is one of the important thing to check whether the journal is adequately strong enough or not. Then one of the reasons a lot of papers get rejected, and this is something I see quite frequently, a research topic is chosen, which often does not have that much relevance today. So it might be that the topic was very exciting about a decade back, and there have been lots of papers and publications on that topic. But a lot of times, what happens is scholars tend to pick up topics based on supervisors' familiarity, or sometimes based on the availability of literature. Now, what happens if the topic has been very widely explored? Then uh, a lot of times it becomes very difficult to carve out something new, to explain some theoretical contribution, to demonstrate some theoretical contribution. So, what is important is we pick up a topic which is very timely, which is very novel, which is very new. For example, today, if I talk of information systems, if I talk of my discipline, because I am coming from the discipline of information systems, topics like metaverse, topics like generative artificial intelligence, these are very, very new. These are considered very novel. But today, if I start undertaking a research on a theme like enterprise resource planning system, then there is a very less chance that I'll be able to manage my publication in a decent journal. I might still, but it is going to be much more, difficult to carve out a really new storyline, a really new contribution for ERP literature. So those are the things, small things that we need to think of, that every area, there will be topics, there will be themes which are very, very important, very, very, uh, new. For example, if I look at, say, some of the other areas, uh, it would be very important that to understand, for example, in marketing, if somebody is looking at, say, theoretically, the phenomena of transgression in, say, social media. So those kind of behavior, consumer behavior, which are considered very new, very upcoming, or things like polarization or acculturation behavior in social media, those kind of consumer behavior related studies might come up as being very new, very novel. But if you are considering a study which is talking about very dated kind of theoretical archetype, say something like brand, very traditional way of branding, then probably it will be very difficult to publish those studies. So what we need to have is we need to have a study which has very good degree of novelty, very timely, very important currently, and then subsequently, we need to have a very strong theoretical contribution. And this is one part that is very, very important, that a lot of studies, sometimes research papers are written, they do not have a theoretical hook. So just adding references, just adding, other citations in a literature is not a theoretical contribution. If you're collecting empirical data and validating the same theoretical model across different contexts of geography, time, or technology, that's not really a theoretical contribution. A theoretical contribution should become like when you're explaining a phenomena, some context, and you are bringing in that theory as a lens, and then you have constructs to explain and operationalizing that context and measure something. So good theory should have uniqueness, parsimony, generalizability, reproducibility, falsifiability, internal consistency, and it should stand the test of time. These are some of the checks that editors would typically try to see, uh, if somebody is trying to establish and build up a good research paper. So if you have a good theory and you have good theoretical contribution, then these are the check boxes that typically needs to be there for an editor to understand that, okay, this person has contributed something and this contribution is going to be evaluated on the basis of these check boxes, that the theory, the constructs that are new, the constructs explain some phenomena very nicely, very simple to understand, and yet there is good amount of generalizability and reproducibility of the results. If you're claiming something, and that should be a methodology with kind of makes it possible for somebody else to validate the research, for somebody else to, kind of undertake the same journey and come to your findings or even maybe counter your findings. So those are the elements that typically a good research paper should try to demonstrate as an objective. So what happens is a lot of times there is a dilemma for many people that what exactly is a contribution. Some people would look for a methodological contribution. So some people like, for example, some of the people work with me, they work on algorithmic development. People typically from information systems or operational research, they would work on creating new algorithms, creating new ML algorithms, or creating new maybe OR models, which itself is a contribution. But that number is very, very less. Most of the time, what happens is we don't really make any kind of algorithmic contribution. We try to make typically a contribution in theory, a contribution in the discipline or the domain. So when we are talking about a contribution in the theory, a contribution in the discipline, what we are trying to do is we are trying to create some predictive model. The model should explain some causal linkages. The model should explain some phenomena and why that phenomena happens. And typically, what we try to do is we try to capture the phenomena using constructs. And if we are trying to capture this phenomena using constructs, it is important for us to understand, is there a mechanism in which we can kind of build bridges among the theory, build bridges among constructs which are coming in from maybe one or more theories? And more importantly, is there a mechanism we can try to identify new linkages which might not be there? A bigger contribution can be when we are trying to identify and define a new construct, a new concept, which may not be existingly there in the literature. Then we try to talk about things like skill development in different stages, how we can kind of define that new construct in a very nice way and develop items which will measure that construct. But that scale development is something that is very risky and itself takes huge amount of time, multiple iterations. And I personally do not suggest scale development in the doctoral research journey because it is also very risky for others to accept whatever you're calling as a new scale. Most of the time, what we do is we are trying to kind of create a causal model which may have few constructs, and we try to explain the dependable, explain some dependent variable with these constructs by looking at the variation of the dependent variable with these constructs. So if we are doing that, then that is a good theoretical contribution, provided the linkages that we are trying to validate, those hypotheses are actually new. The next thing that is important is many of the research journals, especially the top tier journals, want for multi-method, multi-study validation. If we are just creating a validation based on a single study, a single cross-sectional study especially, then many of the top journals will not typically accept that. Many of the top journals have a requirement that if you have any kind of, if you have um, any kind of manuscript, then the manuscript should demonstrate that there is a typical, focus towards multi-study, multi-method, multi kind of setting, which and the studies complement each other. They strengthen each other for the same phenomena. So if we have that, it is easier to go through a better journal. One of the reason a lot of papers get desk rejected is that whenever you are submitting a paper to a journal, you will see that the journal has got a manuscript number. The manuscript number is something that gives you an indication of how many submissions that journal typically has in a year. So suppose today is, 10 days of the year has gone, and if you make a submission to a journal, the journal says that in 10 days, your submission is, say, the 15th submission or the 20th submission. If the journal says that your submission is the 20th submission, then you can understand in a year, the journal will be getting 700 submissions. If a journal gets 700 submissions, and in a year, they're producing only 40 papers or 50 papers or 60 papers, you know that the acceptance rate is below 10%. Some of the journals will get 8,000, 9,000, submissions in a year. But what happens is if you're getting 8,000, 9,000 submissions in a year, then typically it is very difficult for the editors to really deep dive into your research and try to find out the value from your work. So the onus is on the authors to structure the work in such a way that the value of the work, the contribution, and everything becomes very easily available to the editors. They can understand that there is adequate effort which has gone into developing and fine tuning this manuscript. And also, when they send it out for review purposes, it has a better chance of, kind of passing through the review practices. It is very difficult to get reviewers because, am I audible?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir, you're audible.
Yes,
Okay,
sir,
okay.
you are audible.
In between, somebody muted me. So,
You are equal, sir. Yeah.
so what happens is getting reviewers for journals is very, very difficult. And so what happens is if the reviewers are not going to like a paper or looking at the structure and the looking at the flow, an editor feels that it might not pass through the review process, he just rejects it. So it is very important that you demonstrate that all the structure of the paper, the author guidelines are very strongly fulfilled whenever you are developing any kind of manuscript. So I'll talk about some of the elements of how to structure and how to communicate the paper, and also talk about what are the things that in terms of study you need to plan for so that you reach this stage. One of the very first important thing is that you're creating a title page, and then some of the journals have got guidelines for the title page. Like for the title page, Emerald journals typically have that the article title should not be, you know, should be less than 8 words. Some of the journals say that, okay, there is no guidelines for the article title, but anything below, 8 words is also not good. But at the same time, anything above 15 or 20 words is also not good. So we should have an ideal title length, which will kind of make it interesting for us to look at the manuscript, gives us adequate understanding of what the study is. The second thing is that whenever you're talking about, I can share my PPT if you ask me, if you connect with me in LinkedIn, I'll be happy to share my PPT there. Uh, the second thing is like whenever you are talking about the abstract, typically sometimes there is a structured abstract, like in case of Emerald, but in that you have the scope of the study, the contribution, the methodology, the findings. These are typically the constitution of the abstract. But a lot of times what happens is a lot of authors would make a submission in Emerald Journal and then make a submission because it has been rejected there, make the same submission in an Elsevier journal, but this abstract is actually of an Emerald structure. You should actually rework little bit to ensure that these are according to the journal where you're submitting. A lot of times, what happens is if an Elsevier editor gets an abstract which is structured in the Emerald format, they'll straightwise reject that paper. Similar happens for across all major editorial or the major publishing house. So if you're writing an abstract, one of the thing is that typically abstracts are within 150 words, but some journals will allow you to go from 150 to 200 words. So you should include elements like why is the theme important today, what uh, the theoretical lens you have used, what are the key research questions which have been examined, what methodology you have undertaken, and what are the key results and contribution. So you have to ensure that these are the main elements, that the theoretical lens, the research methodology, what questions you're examining, what are the key findings. These are completely documented in the abstract, even if it is for 150 words. And the more important thing is you have adequate balance in the treatment of these small, points. If you have adequate balance, it's not like you say that why the theme is important now, you continue to write maybe 80 words on that in the abstract, and the remaining topics of that 150 word abstract, you just have maybe 20 sentences, 20 words each. You need to have adequate balance treatment of these sections, of these elements in the abstract. The next non-structured abstract. Some of the journals want structured abstract. Some of the journals would also want some additional elements to be there. Like for example, there is this very good journal called IEEE Transactions in Engineering Management. Now IEEE TEM has this thing that there has to be a small section which talks about the implications for research, implications for practice. It's not only the practical implication you copy paste from the same manuscript, but you need to carve it out a little bit differently so that practitioners would understand what is the implications of your study. So those are the additional things that journal to journal, it varies. And you need to plan for these elements if you're going to, kind of develop your manuscript in a very strong way. The third thing, or one of the important things that whenever you're starting a, study, is that how you are carving out the introduction. Sometimes what happens is, especially from India, we get papers which will have just a 2 paragraph of introduction. What happens is if you're writing a 2 paragraph introduction, it does not really build upon what exactly is that you're trying to explore. A typical introduction should have at least 3 to 4 paragraphs, 3 to 5 paragraphs, depending on the nature of the journal you're targeting. If you're targeting a really high-end journal, typically 4 to 5 paragraphs are important. uh, and if the journal is not so highly competitive, then it is all right to have a 3 to 4 paragraph kind of a introduction. But understand something, a lot of times papers get rejected because editors would feel that the motivation is not strong enough, which means that the problematization in the study is inadequate. What exactly you are exploring? What is the gap due to which this is important? To the practice, why is this academic gap important? Communicating these 3 things. First is why to the practice this gap is important. Second, what is the academic gap that you're trying to address? And what exactly is your contribution within this academic gap? What is the research question? What is the research objective that you are exploring? Those elements need to be, very strongly explained in the introduction. And typically you should have maybe 7, 8, maximum of 7, 8, paragraphs, typically 5 to 6 paragraphs, and also have recent references. You can have few, maybe 3, 4 practice references, hyperlinks of maybe news article, of maybe things like maybe links to maybe things like World Economic Forum, or maybe something like World Bank or United Nations. But mostly what you should have is based upon, scientific research papers. So you can have maybe up to maximum of 5 practice references, but build an article typically based on journal contributions, which are from very strong sources. When we are building this introduction, it is basically called as setting the hook. and there was a very nice series of articles from the editors of Academy of Management Journal from AMJ, who talked about how to set the hook, what kind of problematization is needed, and how to build theory, how to position the building of theory through the art of problematization. The next thing, what we talk about is the section which we talk about the literature review. A lot of papers we see, especially if you're not targeting good journals, then it is maybe fine that you combine the literature review with the theory building section. But if you're focusing on good journals, and typically good journals will allow you up to 9,000 to 10,000 words. If you're having 9,000 to 10,000 words, then you need to have a segregated literature review, which is thematically segregated. It explains, how the literature in a particular discipline, how a particular theory is evolving. Yes, we can use citations in the introduction. We should typically use 8 to 10 citations in the introduction. We should use. Now, in the literature review, typically what happens is we should, kind of bring out themes, concepts, the theory. The first can be about the context. Context could be something like, say, the studies about fake news. So you have 1 or 2 paragraphs which talks about fake news. Then the next paragraph, the next subsection in the literature review is about the theoretical hook which you're using. Why is that theoretical hook appropriate, and how have others operationalized that theoretical hook? That is what typically, a literature review should demonstrate. And then you can have a synthesis of the literature review to a diagram or table, in terms of summarizing that entire area. It could be a table like that, or it could be a diagram which explains how the literature, how the nomological network of the literature, the flow of different concepts, how they have evolved over a period of time. It explains very easily to the reader that entire, how the flow of literature has evolved over time. Then we come to the section which is about theory development. The theory development, we have to explain that, okay, for looking at this phenomena, maybe there are few competing theories, and I'm using a theoretical lens because of XYZ reasons. I have to explain why I'm using this lens. It could be 1 theoretical lens, it could be maybe 2, but never more than that. Now, based on the theoretical lens, we basically identify constructs. If it is a positivist study, if it is an interpretive study also, then also I need a theoretical lens. If it is a positivist study, then also I need a theoretical lens, because the theoretical lens helps me view a phenomena very, very objectively. The theoretical lens allows me to view a phenomena very, very objectively. And then if I have that phenomena very objectively defined, very objectively carved out, then it is possible for me to kind of, deep dive into it and find out potential constructs, which helps me to operationalize my research questions and operationalize my hypothesis. So typically, if somebody is doing any kind of positivist work, and my explanation right now is more about positivist kind of structure, where you would be having a hypothesis being validated by some kind of empirical data. In that case, it is always important to have a very good understanding of how many hypotheses you should be having. And for each hypothesis, have 1 paragraph of explanation or 1 paragraph of justification why that hypothesis is important to revisit now, or why that hypothesis is important today to validate. Sometimes what happens is, some of the studies I've seen, they'll probably put in 10, 12, 14 hypotheses. It is important to note that we should not have too many hypotheses. Each hypothesis should ideally have a paragraph of explanation, unless it is a moderation kind of hypothesis. In a moderation kind of hypothesis, you may have 2 paragraphs to explain the different moderating relationships and validate that and justify that. But for other hypotheses, if it is between an independent and a dependent variable, it is not good to have, more than 1 paragraph of, justification for that. So with 1 paragraph of justification, if you consider that a manuscript would have upper limits to the length, maybe 9,000 words or 10,000 words, you would be able to do justice to maybe six, seven, eight hypotheses, but not beyond that. Typically, between five to seven hypotheses is a sweet spot if you're trying to build up a very good empirical study. It is important to explore those hypotheses whose relationship is not yet established. If there is some established hypothesis already that perceived utility leads to intention to use any kind of product, then perceived utility and intention to use is a very widely accepted, kind of hypothesis which has been used across maybe a million publications. Then even if we keep that in the research model, it does not really add any value to any one of us if it is an editor, a reviewer, or a future, reader of your manuscript. So it is important that whenever we are having any kind of these hypotheses, we focus on hypothesis which has not been explored too much. Because simply because if we are focusing on hypothesis which has already been established, then we are spending the most important asset we have at our disposal, which is the number of words to carve out the storyline for our manuscript. We have to be very careful about what we are kind of building up whenever we are developing a very strong study. After this, we have to document the research methodology. Sometimes you can have, if it is a multi-study kind of a research, then you can have a research design section in which you say that, okay, if it is a multi-study kind of thing, the first study is an exploratory study, the second study is a confirmatory study, or if it is a single study kind of a thing, then you start off with the research methodology. And if we are talking of the research methodology, we need to have two, three subsections, how we are collecting the data, how we are doing the data analysis, what will be the tools for validating, what will be the mechanisms to demonstrate robustness checks. Those are elements which are very, very important in the research methodology. If we are having a, mix of research design, like for example, we have one study which is coming out as an exploratory study. Like if you look at many of my studies, which are published in say A-star journals, I would typically have one exploratory study, then I would typically have one confirmatory study, and then maybe also have a predictive study. So I'll combine three studies in the same research papers. So I need a research design which will explain how these studies are complementing each other, how they strengthen each other, and how these studies are, fitting each other to contribute and communicate the same story. And what is that contribution that I'm going to make? So the research design is needed first, whether if it is a, multi-study kind of a thing, or if it is a single study, then we call it as a research methodology section. But we need this section which talks about how the data is going to be collected, who is the sample, how will we approach them. If it is something that is based on very convenience, purely because say I have access to students, I make students fill up my research questionnaire, then that's not going to sail. I see a lot of studies which are purely based on student data, then that does not really create any kind of value for the research. So the research fraternity that is very clearly there that this is something based on convenience, and this findings will not be generalizable to a larger population, to a larger community. So we cannot really trust those kind of studies. So we need to have a sampling strategy, something like say something like a stratified sampling or a systematic sampling if you're doing an empirical study where there is a survey questionnaire and we try to get the data from different people who are users of a particular system or users of a particular product and so on. The other side of it is a real, because management is a very applied discipline and it is in an organizational setting. If we can get organizational data, if we can get organizational data, and then we are building a study based on cases which are done from organizations, maybe two, three different organizations in the same industry, then that can also become extremely, extremely valuable. Single cross-sectional study, most of the top journals now, I wouldn't say even top journals, even the A-level or B-level journals are rejecting now. If it is a single cross-sectional study, we just float that survey instrument to people who are there in our WhatsApp groups, or they are there in my LinkedIn profile or in my Facebook profile. And based on, the access towards people, they fill it up and then they say that, okay, This is what my understanding is. Then what happens is journals will typically not really trust that data. These are some of the challenges due to which a lot of papers get, desk rejected. Then the next part is how we are representing the findings. If we have our findings clearly documented, typically first thing that they look for is who are the people whose data we are, kind of reporting. We need to give very detailed, to the extent possible, the respondents profile, the demographic information. And for this demographic information, the people who are, responding to the questions, we can have descriptive statistics like this is the percentage, say 55% male, 45% female. Is it important? There's a question. Is it important to explain each methods used in the research study on paper, how these methods impact the study? So if you're looking at, the research methodology, you are using a method. You're not really contributing to the theory of the method. So what is happening is if you're using a method, you need to, kind of have that much of that much of information which explains that you are using a particular data analysis method and you know adequately about the method. For example, if you're doing path analysis on your research, then you know adequately about what path analysis is. If you're doing a qualitative control, say QC kind of analysis, then you know that okay, this is what the main references of QC are, and these are the you know elements of QCA which needs to be there in all the papers. So you need to demonstrate that using a paragraph, max 2 paragraphs, that this is what the methodology is in terms of research analysis of the data. And the research methodology consists of data acquisition, which is basically the sampling strategy, then the data analysis methodology, and then how you are checking the robustness. You need to have these 3 elements in the research methodology section. Hope I could answer your question. So when we are talking about the findings, I see a lot of papers who would just say that I want to explore, okay, to what extent people trust technology. Say that is basically the question that you're trying to explore. So what you will do is maybe do you trust the information that you see on say WhatsApp? And then you have a question 50 and the answers are like 50% said yes, they trust the value of the answers they see in WhatsApp. 30% said that they don't trust. Those kind of statistics, if you're using it, that is mainly descriptive statistics. It is not for any causal or inferential analysis that can potentially happen. Typically, that kind of studies are called market research studies. We need to avoid market research studies. We need to have mechanisms in which we build studies which will provide some kind of uh, answers to why certain phenomena is observed in a certain way. If people are leaving the organizations due to, say, COVID happened, and after people are called back to office, people are not really joining the office, they're leaving the jobs. Why is it that people are leaving the jobs? So we need answers to whys, not responses which will analyze and give us that, okay, 40% of the people said they don't want to join back their organization. 30% said that they will be okay about joining back the organization if they allow 2 days of work from home. These kind of answers are not really the causal research. What we need to have is basically causal research. So we need to have a theoretical model which will explain that the people intention to leave jobs, people intention to, kind of throw away their career is dependent upon, contingent upon certain factors that they cannot control for. So we need to arrive at those factors and explain that how these factors affect the phenomena. What is the significance of journal article as compared to empirical papers? See, journal articles are research papers. You would typically not be able to publish any journal articles if it's not a research paper. Sometimes conceptual papers are published by journal articles, but that is very, very rarely. Unless you are very senior in the discipline, you would not be invited to contribute any conceptual papers. Mostly research papers which are published would be based on based on empirical evidences, whether it is qualitative or quantitative, but it's all empirical papers. So when we are reporting, say it is cross-sectional studies, then cross-sectional studies could be based on measurement and structural model. It addresses things like reliability. It tries to address things like validity. And you create these reliability, validity in different subsections of the findings so that it is easy to identify these subsections. If an editor is there who just scrolls through your manuscript, he or she would be able to identify that these are the elements uh, which will typically be, you know, these are the elements which will typically be there in the study. So there is no concern surrounding how these things are, demonstrated in the research methodology. So the question is, so conceptual papers do carry equal significance in the teaching field? Yes, it does. If you write conceptual papers and they're published in a good journal, it definitely carries equal significance or importance. But from my experience, conceptual papers are typically invited papers. And people will invite a person to write a conceptual paper or an opinion paper only if the person has already published good amount of research papers in the top journals. So for early career academics, this is not really suggested. After probably you have published maybe 50, 100 papers, then you are invited typically and you are well cited, then probably you'll be invited to contribute conceptual papers. At the entry level, it is very difficult. So when we are talking about the findings, we need to structure the findings based on what research questions we have, how the flow of the research questions are also adequately demonstrated by the way that the findings are, structured in the manuscript. That is very, very important. So we need to demonstrate, like if it is something like survey-based, theory-driven studies, we are explaining how GFI, then things like other statistical analysis, whether it is like something like UCA, whatever statistical analysis are required that are adequately, listed down. And if you're looking at methods or algorithmic oriented studies, things like priorities, rankings, sensitivity analysis, these are kind of demonstrated in the article adequately. So the results of the findings need to have these sections very well defined, very well articulated, so that from the findings, it is very clear that how the findings are related to the research questions and how the findings, answer the hypothesis or the research model that you have proposed. One of the important thing is when you are proposing the research model, I often come across papers which propose a very nice diagrammatic representation of a framework. The diagram or the framework is very exciting, but it is not something that can be validated. It's a good framework. It is something to understand, but there is no validation which is possible. For example, if I talk about this image is a nice framework, but it is not an image that can be validated. These kind of things can go well in an editorial. If you're writing an opinion paper, if you're writing an editorial, then these kind of things are fine. But if you're writing something which is a theoretical model, then it is important to understand that whatever you're saying needs to have a mechanism for validation. If you're talking about a qualitative study also, a qualitative study may not have hypotheses, but there should be propositions. So when we talk of the findings, we need to basically showcase how, if it is a quantitative study, what were the path analysis results? We need to demonstrate that. If it is a qualitative study, what are the propositions that we are building based on, the analysis we have completed? We need to articulate that, structure that well, and provide that maybe in a diagrammatic representation if possible. That helps us in terms of explaining to the readers how different slices, how different artifacts tie together down so that it tells one very strong story very concurrently. Then, this is another place where there is a lot of problems. People often combine the results and discussion together. You need to have segregation of all this different sections very, very crisply. You need to have a different result section. You need to have a different discussion section. You need to have a different conclusion section. So the discussion section typically, first of all, talks about what your core findings are. If you're talking about what are your core findings in one or two paragraphs, then you start explaining what is your contribution to the theory, what is your contribution to the literature. And we often find papers which will talk about what they are contributing, but they do not cite the literature that they are extending. You need to cite the exact papers that you're trying to extend. You need to cite and build upon which are the studies that you're explaining, what are the studies that you're extending in your. If you're countering certain studies, that is also fine. If you're countering that somebody else found this relationship, and we found that this relationship is not positive association, but this relationship is a negative association, that is fine. But we need to counter that, and we need to cite the studies that we are contradicting. When we are countering studies, or when we are saying that the existing literature shows something and our phenomena, our examination explains something very, very opposite, that can be a very strong contribution. But be very careful that we should have a very strong theoretical understanding and a very strong methodological elements in the study before we counter anything. If the methodologies are very strong, there are no biases in the way that the research has been indicated, then contradictions is not a problem. But most of the time, what we do is we try to extend the literature. We try to extend existing published studies. So what we need to do is we need to find out that these are the main studies which we are trying to extend. And when we are trying to extend certain studies, it will be great if we are building upon the publications in which we are trying to target the publication in. So if we are, trying to say that we are publishing in XYZ journal, or say, for example, like the journal that I am editing is International Journal of Information Management Data Insights. Now, in that journal, if somebody wants to extend literature, I would expect that he cites those studies he's trying to extend. He cites those papers he's trying to extend. That helps me get a better understanding of what is the contribution all about. Does it really add to the discourses that I typically have ongoing in my journal? So if I have discourses which are ongoing in my journal, how does this current study help in extending those, deliberation? How does this current study help in strengthening those discourses? We need to have mechanisms for measuring that, mechanisms for demonstrating and signaling that. So the first subsection is basically we try to explain what are the contributions to literature, what are the contributions to theory, and there we try to cite adequate literature. Typically, in this section, I would talk about citing maybe 5 to 10 articles, maybe, trying to say that this is what these studies talked about, and this is how I'm trying to extend these studies. This is where I'm extending studies or contradicting existing knowledge. If I do that, that is what forms my contribution to literature. The second subsection that we typically have is implications for practice. I would typically say that depending on journals, contribution to literature or contribution to theory is something that we strengthen a lot more. Typically, that will be 3 to 5 paragraphs or 3 to 4 paragraphs. But for a journal which is not that highly rated, maybe that will be 2 to 3 paragraphs. And if we are, kind of looking for journals which are relatively accepting shorter articles, like I know that a lot of emerald journals which are not that highly rated, they would typically have a upper limit for the manuscript. They'll say that you need to have a manuscript of 5,000 or 6,000 words. If you have any kind of manuscript which is for 5,000 or 6,000 words, then this can be something like 2 to 3 paragraphs of contributions to theory, and then you have 1 paragraph of implication for practice. Now, this also varies journal to journal. Some journals will have higher treatment for the contribution to theory, and they'll prefer 3 to 4 paragraphs on contribution to theory. But the implications for practice, they are okay about 1 paragraph of implications for practice. So if you are writing something for journals which are more focused on the theory, then write a larger, longer contributions to theory. And if you're writing a journal for a journal which has very strong practice, then write a longer implication to practice. So these treatment differences need to be balanced out whenever you are making any submissions, to any journals. So one way to check that is look at all the papers, look at maybe the general issue papers, not go for the special issue, because special issues are often managed by the guest editors. And sometimes the editors might not be in a position to check what the guest editors are doing. So don't look for guest edited, articles. Look for the generally edited articles, which will have typically the associate editors or the editor in chief handling the papers. And then look at the structure of the discussion to define and carve out this part really elaborately. Then the third subsection, sometimes some of the papers would typically, kind of keep this as a subsection in the discussion or keep it as a full section. I personally prefer this as a subsection. This could be the last subsection of the, discussion section where we talk about the limitations. There are three things we can highlight as limitations. First is one is the methodological limitation. So, for example, if we are doing an analysis with a cross-sectional study, we cannot have any causal claims. If you're doing any kind of cross-sectional study, we cannot have any causal claims. So we need to explain that very elaborately that it is a single cross-sectional study, so it cannot have any causal claim. If it is two cross-sectional study on the same demographic and is like a quasi-longitudinal study, then that is very good. Then we can say that this is very good and this is something that is going to sail through test of time, and so we can make some causal claims. Then we need to have also tests for reverse causality. If you have not done that, then we need to highlight that test for reverse causality has not been undertaken. On the other side, if we are doing some study, say, which is a single case, or if it is a study, say, which is a single case study done in an organization, we need to explain that, okay, whatever our findings are from this single organization, then there is a chance that, it might not hold true for other organizations which are not from the same industry or having the same degree of maturity or size. We need to highlight this as methodological limitations, sampling limitations. But please note that if we are seeing that we collected data from student population and that is a limitation of a study, that is not going to sail well. We need to do whatever is the possible in the best way possible to carve out, to get the data, demonstrate the methodologies as robust as possible. But all methodologies have limitations. So for example, if you're having a cross-sectional study, which is a survey, and we are analyzing the results of the survey through methods, let's say like SEM or path analysis, then we have hypotheses which are very associative in nature. It is possible to, kind of validate those hypotheses, typically by using these methods of, SEM or path analysis. But what is not possible is having some causal claims. So if we are creating on one side a laboratory experiment or a quasi experiment, then subsequently that quasi experiment also has got limitation. A quasi experiment might not have external, generalizability. It might not have external validity. So we need to understand that if you're doing quasi experiments in the lab, that might not have external validity. So we need to acknowledge that. So we need to acknowledge that whether for the first part of a study, we did an experiment that has, restrictions on the external validity, but it has very strong internal reliability. So we acknowledge that. If the next study is basically a survey, and we say that, okay, the survey has lesser challenges of demonstrating causal linkages, but it has very high, kind of external validity. If we do that, then that is going to give a lot more confidence to the reviewers, confidence to the editors that you are familiar with the methodological limitation that you have. You can highlight sampling limitation, but it is not really something that is really, explained. But yes, sampling limitation, if you're saying that you undertook this study in a emerging economy or in a developing economy, you do not expect the same results to be replicated in a developed economy, say in a country in Europe or say in a country like US, and you say that there are inherent, say cultural elements or resource constraints which are there in the theory, due to which it might not be reflected in a developed economy. Then you can highlight the sampling limitations while you're theorizing. Otherwise, if you're just going with convenience sampling and then highlight the sampling limitations, it's not going to really sail in the top journals. Then subsequently, we can provide the future research directions. Typically, 2, 3 different research agendas we need to highlight, which could be based on your core findings and limitations of your current study. Uh, Here you can say that different samples, different industries, different timeframes can be explored. Uh, but it is more important in, especially for top journals, that you say that what elements of the theory has not been really covered. I mean, one of the easier ways is to basically say that different samples, different industries, and different timeframes can be explored. But the theoretical gaps which has not yet been discovered, but you could discover them if you can highlight that, that really makes a very impactful research direction. Now, the problem is once you are seeing that theoretical gap is there, it also means that people will build upon that theoretical gap, which also means that you don't have guarantee that you have identified that theoretical gap very, very religiously, very, very elaborately, and you will continue to be able to use that theoretical gap for your future studies. Because others, when they see your study, they may start exploring that theoretical gap. So sometimes what happens is if your theoretical gap is on the basis of your thesis, then people would try to abstract that, not very crisply give that away. In that case, you can give directions to future research based on these kind of methodological limitations. But ideally, if you're looking for the top journals, they would want any kind of theoretical gap to be reflected in terms of future research directions. The last part, which is very important, is basically the conclusion. A lot of times, a lot of authors, especially early career researchers, they would say that, okay, I'm exploring, I have already thought of my analysis and I have already created my discussion. So discussion and conclusion are kind of combined. And people don't really have clarity of what is discussion, what is conclusion. Discussion is about your findings, very true. Conclusion is also about your findings. But the point is, in discussion, what you're trying to carve out is you try to explain how your discussion, extends existing literature. And how in your discussion, you try to explain how does your discussion really contributes to new inputs for practitioners. But in case of conclusion, what you try to do is you try to, kind of explain that what are the very core findings from your research, what are the very core, core contribution, unique contributions that your study makes. So if you're having those unique contributions, so if you're having these unique contributions that your study makes, that is typically the focus for carving out the conclusion section. The conclusion section is very different from the discussion section. And if your conclusion section is not articulated separately, please ensure that you articulate it separately. Avoid any tables or figures in conclusion. If you want to have a figure which synthesizes your findings, you can at best put it in the discussion section. Especially if you have a qualitative study, then in the discussion section, you can kind of build a framework based on your qualitative findings, which kind of joins maybe or maybe combines or provides a synthesis of the propositions you might have built. But in the conclusion section, do not have any table, do not have any, diagram in the conclusion section, and avoid duplication of text between the abstract, introduction, and the conclusion. The conclusion is something about your core findings, and it brings a punchline to your entire article when the article is being read by a reviewer. With this, stop. We move on to the final, the part, which is basically the references. One of the major problem is, since we are in a very resource constrained kind of resource constrained kind of ecosystem, our universities often do not have access to databases, access to research papers. So what happens from India? A lot of people would read papers that they have access to. The problem with that is if your fundamental building blocks are based out of literature which are not very strong, which are not rated very highly, then you would not have very strong trust on the findings that you're trying to publish. So always ensure that your journal publications, you try to have a research paper which has at least 35 to 40 journal publications. And for journals which are typically accepting papers up to I would say 9,000 words, I typically go for 60 kind of 60 plus minus some delta kind of references. Always have references uh, which would be kind of built from the top sources, good quality journals. So one of the metric that I follow is trying to tell people that pull in references from journals which are published from Elsevier, Emerald, Wiley, Taylor Francis, these kind of journals, the top publishers, because their process goes through a very strong editorial practice, especially Wiley, Taylor Francis, Elsevier, and Springer. These four are the biggest publishers and their processes are very, very rigorous. So if you pull out journals which are there for some time, which have very high site score or impact factor, then it is very good. It is potentially something that has high citability. The other side of it is uh, when you are putting down your references, ensure that the references are completed. Ensure that you have all the information of the references. What happens is a lot of early career researchers would be having, would be having references picked up from Google Scholar, copied from Google Scholar, or using a software. So if you're using a software, a lot of times the references might not be complete. Open up the source, go to the journal homepage, and then look at the source. You might not have the DOI provided, or you might not have the volume number or the issue number given. Ensure you have the references, if they're copied from Google Scholar, that you have the entire reference completed. A lot of times, what happens is the references are not completed, and for very competitive journals, it becomes the basis for rejecting that the authors do not really know how to build the references. So obviously, their theoretical hook and everything is not going to be so strong. So editors would typically have a canned response that they will give that your problematization is probably not that strong, your contribution is not that strong, so we are rejecting the paper. So try to have at least, 30, 40 references from top journals, very good journals, at least ABDCA and above when you're talking of, any of these references or very high site score, typically site score 10 and above or impact factor 5 and above. Those kind of metrics you should be using. Minimize the references from internet or trade literature. If you have 4 or 5 references from trade literature, it is fine, but beyond that, it is not really advisable. Try to build your articles mainly based on, journal papers, not conference papers, but mostly from journal papers. Selective references. These are something which are fairly easily accessible, and these are something that what I have said is not something very new, but there are many editorials which talks about these, how to build good quality theory, article, what kind of elements should be there in the research paper, what constitutes a theoretical contribution, what theoretical contribution is not, how do reviewers evaluate manuscripts, how should reviewers evaluate manuscripts. There are lots of editorial guidelines. You can have a look at that. With this, I'll come to the end of my study, or I'll come to the end of my presentation. I'll take up the questions one by one. One of the question is, Dr. Manju has already asked, if the results of a study is different from the results which has already been done, what should we do? So if the results of your study is different from the results which have already been published, first of all, that can be a very good contribution, provided your results have been obtained when there is a very strong methodological rigor. If we are having adequate methodological rigor, You have not taken responses based on convenience. You have not collected data based on convenience. How you have measured, say you have got some constructs for your theory building, and those constructs for theory building, you have typically, validated in terms of face validity, you have demonstrated different types of reliability, then normally you are not expected to have reports which will be opposite. But if it is opposite, what you can do is you can still share it, report it, and then explain because of the context. The uniqueness of the context is such that there are different findings. The uniqueness of the concept basically requires you to kind of focus on very different kind of findings. In that case, it is absolutely fine if you have research papers where the contribution is very, very different, where it is, what you're finding out is slightly different from what existing literature has showed, then it is absolutely fine. But other than that, do double check on what your methodological rigor is. Have you adequately taken methodological rigor before you are committing to that my findings are different from another paper? The other important part of it is if you say that my contributions, my findings are different from another paper, has that paper been published in a top journal? If that paper is published in a very ordinary journal, then probably that paper has also not undertaken the methodology, the rigor adequately. If they have also not undertaken the review rigor, the methodological rigor, the testing, the validation very adequately, then saying that my results oppose that does not make any sense. It is better not to even cite that paper, but just say that your findings are so and why you believe that. Because there might be many papers which are there which do not have adequate build-up or which do not have adequate validation in terms of rigor in the methodology, in terms of how the theoretical tenets were built, how the constructs were measured, all those things. It is very important that you do that very, very rigorously whenever you are doing that. Hope I could answer your question. The second question is from Jend Narayan. Can we mention AI-based tools in references which were used during research? AI-based tools should not be mentioned in references. Uh, AI-based tools help you to maybe correct some elements of your English. They should never be used to write anything. For example, if you have ChatGPT and you're writing something using those tools, it is very easy to write something saying that, please explain uh, how COVID helped digital transformation, or give me a paragraph with references how COVID helped organizations to embrace, say, Microsoft Teams or Zoom as a technology. Now, what happens is ChatGPT will give you the references. ChatGPT will also generate that paragraph for you, but that is not really something that will actually, first of all, be accurate. It might just create phony references, and you will have no idea of knowing whether that it is phony or not. The other part of it goes against ethics. It goes against research ethics. So if you're doing that, and what happens is these editorial manager platforms also have got a lot of these tools. So you have submitted a paper, it might happen that it goes through, but later on, if the editors get to understand, because these tools analyze the data even after your acceptance, and then realizes that this is a generated AI generated kind of article, then it will basically send that as a flag. And what will happen is that article is likely to get kind of rejected. There may be a retraction of that article, and if you have a retraction, it's very difficult to come back from one retracted paper in a career. The top institutions, universities will not hire you. Further, submitting paper in better journals become very, very difficult. People will not really trust you. A lot of questions will be asked if you continue to submit in good journals. So try to avoid retractions. Sometimes retractions can happen even if you have done everything, but try to do everything before that retraction happens. Especially never use any AI generated kind of, manuscripts. Hope I could answer your question.
I'm requesting participants, please ask questions. I'm
So if you feel, you can always reach out to me in LinkedIn. I'm sharing my LinkedIn profile. So if you want, if you have queries, you can always reach out to me in LinkedIn. Normally, I give feedback and responses back very frequently. So feel free to reach out, connect. I'd be happy to give any feedback.
Any questions?
There is one question. One question is, research scholars can use paraphrasing tool. No, it is not advised. Again, that will be noted as a AI generated tool. So it is not really advised to use any kind of paraphrasing tool. It can get caught very easily and then it becomes a very big problem. So the other thing is that one thing which is threatening us is the APC of journals. So the journal I manage is also an open access journal. So APC is something that is coming in. I really do not know what is going to be a response for that because all these Elsevier, Springer, Emerald, Taylor Francis, everywhere it is slowly happening that all the governments are saying that you need to publish, all the funding agencies are saying that you need to publish in open science. Now, what is going to happen is a lot of these journals are going to be converted over the next 4 or 5 years into open science. And what will happen is Indian government is also deliberating about some policy at the national level where open access will be facilitated and some contracts will be made. But I think this is something of a little challenge right now. But universities need to think of mechanisms of funding open access. I know even in IIT, we don't have funding for open access. Uh, but this is one of the bigger challenges. But universities are looking at mechanisms to try and see which journals they'll find. They'll not fund all the journals, but maybe like for example in IIT Delhi, they have this rule that if any journal has an impact factor which is equivalent or higher than Nature Communications, then they will allow it to be open access. The similar rules can be adopted if it is, I mean, Nature Communications is very, very high, but again, some rules, some mechanisms saying that if it is a Q1 journal and then only the university will support open access. Those kind of things from the administrators would be helpful because all the other countries are slowly moving towards open access. And this is something that, I mean, it is challenging for us in an Indian ecosystem, but this is how it is going to happen in the years to come.
Now I'm requesting participants, please raise your questions. If there is any questions, please ask.
I'll share my presentation here itself as a PDF document. That is not a problem.
Thank you very much, sir, for giving a detailed information from the era of publishings and how to focus of good quality journals and where we need to publish and identifications of most relevant topics. So these are the topics were covered by you, sir. It's very interactive session and very fruitful session to our participants, sir.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm unable to share my PPT or PDF, but I think later on I can share it with
I'm
the
audible, ma'am. My question is written in chat box.
Okay, okay, sir.
Kindly,
Sure, sir, sure.
hello.
Yes. Yes.
Sir,
How can I
yes, sir.
introduce my research in introduction and abstract to avoid this rejection? As I said,
Yes, yes.
introduction part, first we have to explain why that phenomenon is important, how widespread that phenomena is. And then I start talking about why I'm using a particular theoretical lens to view that phenomena and what is the gap in the existing theoretical understanding of that phenomena. So I need to have this in the first 3, 4 paragraphs. And then I come to my research questions in the introduction, followed by I would say the how the remaining article, the remaining manuscript is structured. If I follow this in the introduction, I think that will make it more strong. But yes, the entire article has to be written. It's not that just the introduction is important, but the entire article, how the research is conducted, how the research has been articulated, everything needs to be really strongly developed.
Now, I would like to call co-convener Dr. Jayant Isaac sir to present a vote of thanks.
Sir, what are the items should be mentioned in the abstract, sir?
What? Come again?
What are the items should be exist in the abstract? That is the methodology, sampling techniques, or what are the should be
So in
a
the
standard
abstract,
parameters?
you need to put maybe one sentence on what exactly is the query, what exactly is the area of research, then two sentences on maybe what is the theoretical lens you're adopting, then one or two sentences on the methodology that you're undertaking, and maybe 2 to 3 sentences on the findings. So you need to follow this kind of a structure in the abstract.
And I found the Emerald and other journals articles, the originality or the empirical
Is
work,
the contribution?
empirical
How do you find your
implication.
contribution?
Yes,
Yeah, that needs to be
yes,
there.
sir. How
That
how can it be? How it can be right, sir?
this is
That
something
is
that
that is the finding, or is it different from other?
it's not the finding. It's about what elements in your theoretical model nobody else has explored. If you have a theoretical model, to what extent that has not been explored by anybody else? No other literature has really focused into developing that. Unless you have that, it is not really going to be a very, useful or a very strong research. So you need to explain, you need to do a lot of reading. Unless you have a lot of reading, you won't know what else is explored. So you need to be very thorough with the literature. Once you are very thorough with the top literature, you know really well what are the discourses in that particular discipline. Only then you'll have confidence to say that nobody else has talked about these things. So when you make a claim, those three things are new, those three relationships are new, or this construct is new, the reviewer should not be able to or should not be in a position to refute that whatever you're saying, already some other paper has already talked about it. So you need to have that confidence and that confidence will only come whenever you are talking about, very strong, literature review. If you do a very strong literature review, especially a very strong systematic literature review, don't go with bibliometrics. Bibliometrics are, I mean, have no value. It's just a data description using tools like VOS Viewer and so on. Undertake a very strong systematic literature
Yes,
review.
sir.
It will give you very good understanding. SLRs are good. Bibliometric, I know a lot of bibliometric studies get published, but it has no value. Most of the journals otherwise will not really publish any bibliometrics.
Thank you so much, sir, for your
Welcome.
informative information, sir. Thank you so much.
Any questions? Can I wind up the session? Any questions, please?
No.
There is another question. Yeah, so there is one question from Ariba. How to choose methodology while writing research paper based on qualitative analysis. So qualitative analysis, like literature review is not a qualitative analysis. Literature review, very soon I'll be publishing one article, how to undertake a systematic literature review. You can just have a look at that. Once it is online, maybe I'll share it. Maybe it has been accepted. It will probably come online in another 30 days or so max. If you message me in LinkedIn, I'll share the link of that. The other side of it is when you're writing qualitative research papers. Recently, we published a paper in Technological Forecasting and Social Change, which is on social bot. If you search for that paper, try to structure your paper like that. I've written some qualitative research papers, not much. Most of my research is qualitative. but have a look at that paper which is on social bot if it is on qualitative, and you can follow the structure, how to undertake the research methodology, the analysis of the data. You can follow that structure. I feel that the structure has really evolved well in that paper.
Sir, if it is possible, then you can share your research paper link, sir, in a group or in chat box.
Okay, I'll try to do that. In the let me just do that. So